Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar regarding managing complex revenue inside of NetSuite. My name is Joe Scavano, and I'm the Senior Director of Solution Consulting here. I have helped companies over the past 7.5 years work entirely inside of the NetSuite platform, helping them optimize their order-to-cash process, really focusing on the billing and revenue recognition. Now, a little bit of an agenda for what we're going to be focusing on today. First, going to give a little bit of background on who Zone is. We'll talk a little bit about some of the native challenges that companies who are using NetSuite are going to see on a day-to-day basis. We'll then talk about what is ZoneBilling, why it was built, how we ultimately designed it to work in conjunction with the NetSuite's advanced revenue management. We'll then follow that up with a demonstration so you can see how we are taking our billing activities and ultimately syncing with the RevRec, and then we'll follow it up with the Q&A. But a little bit of background about Zone. Zone is a company that has built a number of different applications inside of NetSuite. So here we have over 14 different applications, like I said, built entirely inside the walls of NetSuite. Today's session will be focusing on our billing product. But as you can see here, we have a number of different ones, including our OCR product, where we're going to be able to read vendor bills, which are Zone Capture, as well as our Zone Reporting, which works on Power BI as well. And just a little bit about, again, a little bit more about who Zone is. Really, what our whole design is to really just enhance the NetSuite experience. As someone who's been leveraging the platform for so long, it is so powerful, the NetSuite ecosystem, but really we're extending its capabilities and really helping the finance and accounting teams optimize their day-to-day. But before we actually dive in, and talk about the specific products, kind of what I've seen over the number of years that have been helping companies leveraging either native NetSuite billing functionalities or having to use a disparate system is what's going on. What are some of those challenges that you might ultimately face, right? So companies that are leveraging a third-party platform that having to rely on some sort of integrations or having to do manual reconciliations, right? That's really coming up with cause for or injecting risk into the process, right? As a former auditor myself, I was always having to double check, well, where is the source of truth, right? I lived in the accounting field for a number of years prior to joining the ecosystem, and having to see how companies are reconciled. What source of truth is this? Well, this came from a separate CRM. Then this went to a third-party platform. Well, ultimately, how do I know which one is correct? Additionally, when you're having to rely on that information, well, where is finance living, right? Finance now has to live in multiple different systems, and that ultimately is leading to lack of visibility. That visibility could be in when am I billing next? When am I ultimately recognizing revenue? I've talked to companies, in the 50+ million in annual revenue, billing and recognizing out of Google Sheets. And he candidly told me that yes, they've made mistakes. Now that is alarming, right? A Google Sheet is very risky. Anyone could just hit, the backspace key, and you're just messing with all the formulas, and everything is just moving on. But so those are some of the inherent of having a disparate risk of having a disparate system. But how does ZoneBilling come into play here? Is we took our native product, right, injected it inside of NetSuite. So our entire ecosystem is the finance doesn't need to leave the NetSuite platform. We're really extending its capabilities. And what it's going to allow us to do is handle any type of billing scenario that you're going to throw at us. From simple fixed recurring, monthly, quarterly, annually, with updates. Or is it going to be handled a little bit more nuanced with usage? We've been seeing more and more companies evolve and getting into companies with maybe prepaid usage where, hey, I want to go give you an upfront payment of $5,000, and that gives me maybe 100,000 text messages to deplete accounts over the year. Now, each one of those scenarios that I just talked about actually has a very separate and unique revenue recognition challenge. And that's now where Zone or native NetSuite's ARM comes into play. Right? So native NetSuite's ARM or advanced revenue management really helps streamline your revenue recognition. Right? It's setting up an individual item master with the correct revenue recognition rules, right? And it works off of a native NetSuite sales order or an invoice. right? It helps become compliant with ASC 606, as well as compatible with other industry standards, such as IFRS 15. One of the key things is it's entirely inside NetSuite. It's a native NetSuite product that they come up with. But sometimes we've seen customers really having issues with leveraging NetSuite's R module, because what they're really having issues with is the native NetSuite billing functionality. Now, it's not really an issue. It's more of companies are evolving, right? We've seen a massive shift from companies selling one-time products to selling some sort of recurring in nature. Maybe it's monthly or quarterly. And native NetSuite sales orders 100% solves for that, right? You can use a billing schedule to be able to do it. But one of the issues is what happens when there's a modification? What happens when there's contracts a little bit more complex these days? Typically, that would result in customers for an upsell scenario. Maybe they need to actually terminate the entire sales order, unwind everything, and recreate a new sales order. What happens if you have a scheduled 5% annual uplift, right? It's 100 in year one and 105 in year two. How do you actually document that on that sales order, right? Those scheduled price changes, right, is ultimately happen to be on two separate lines, but that makes it really challenging to have it flow into a single revenue element on a revenue arrangement. Now, I might be using some terminology for people today, revenue arrangements, revenue elements. I don't need to talk a lot more about that. But the idea is a revenue element is your performance obligation, right? What do you need to deliver to your customers? That's your performance obligation. So ZoneBilling is going to be able to solve all of those complexities because we're injecting our subscription or our contract directly into NetSuite. And it's prior to the sales order or the invoice creation process. That's really key because this is now where we can handle all of those scheduled changes, the quantity change or the rate change. We're going to be able to handle those contract modifications. What if a customer calls you up 1 year into their 3-year contracts and says, hey, unfortunately, I just need to terminate our contract? How are you going to handle that? Well, you might need to create a standalone, create a credit memo, kind of process that. And that's going to create a separate credit memo, which creates a separate revenue arrangement. Now, from a visibility perspective, yes, you could go ahead and manually merge those revenue arrangements, but any allocations, implications need to take place. That's going to be extremely difficult. What ZoneBilling is going to offer is that flexibility within the contract. We call it a subscription. It doesn't need to be a subscription for you, right? A lot of our customers aren't just in the software space, right? They're really extending any single industry. But our subscription is designed to handle those changes. So we can just update the end date. And that automatically is going to have a credit memo or return authorizations or credit memos be generated. All of the revenue activities is generated from Zone subscription now. One of the biggest differences that we need to kind of walk through today is our subscription is now the source of the revenue arrangement. And that is what gives us the tremendous flexibility to continuously update and modify the subscription and have that automatically flow into the NetSuite's revenue arrangement. So with that, let's actually go ahead and hop into a demonstration. Now, before we kind of just dive in and talk just RevRec, which I can just talk about for hours and hours on end, I want to give a little bit of an overview demonstration of ZoneBilling, right? Just so you can see how the records work, how they ultimately function, how we create native NetSuite invoices off those records. Let's actually hop in. So now I'm taken to a native NetSuite customer record, right? Nothing is changing here. Like I said, ZoneBilling is entirely inside of the walls of NetSuite. But one of the new things that we now have is a tab here called the subscriptions. Like I said, the subscriptions represents your contract with your customers. And I can just dive into the one here called applied use case one, right? So here's just, a number of different contracts. As I hop into our first contract here, as you can see, the subscription is now containing all of the relevant information for what did the customer sign up for. I have a 1-year contract in place, or with an annual charge schedule. Think of that charge schedule as your billing cadence. Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? One of the great things about this is, regardless of duration, if you choose an annual contract, it could sell for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 20 years. The system is automatically going to determine the charge frequency, and I'll talk more about that. But like I said, the subscription is really your home base. This is going to tell you everything that's pertaining to this contract. You can see all of the various products that the customer chose. We have a one-time charge. We have a subscription license and usage. You can see the duration of those. That's really important when we talk about some upsells and downsell activities. We can see how the product is being sold. Is it one-time, fixed, recurring, usage? But one of the great things about Zone is we give you the ability to have separate charge schedules from the header of the contract versus the line of the contract. Right, so this is giving us additional flexibility to be determined the billing cadence. Now, living within our subscription, we can now see all activities such as my billing charges, and billing charges represents future line items on an invoice. As you can see, our first two are actually in a status of bills. We can actually drill into these invoice transactions that were created, but you now have a forecast view of everything going out into the future. We also have our related transactions tab, right? That's going to just kind of compile all of those native sales orders or invoices that we ultimately create. But more importantly, why we're kind of here to tell you, we have our revenue tab. Like I said, ZoneBilling is connecting directly with the NetSuite's revenue, and it's our subscription that's really bringing us together, right? So typically you're going to see a one-to-one relationship between the subscription and a revenue arrangement. Now, if I just dive in, let's just look at our native NetSuite invoice transaction, right? So this is just a pretty simple invoice, just a fixed recurring product and a one-time fee here. But again, it's a native NetSuite transaction here. Now let's go back quickly and look at our contract items or subscription items here. And we'll look at our subscription license. So I'm now taken to you our subscription item. And this is the product that we physically sold, and it is the subscription license. This is actually really important. We are leveraging the native NetSuite SKU here. Why that's so important is because this is what is determining the GL impact as well as your revenue recognition rule. Because we're inside of NetSuite, we don't need to duplicate our item masters or maintain a separate and distinct, revenues engine as well. Now, inside of here, right, we can see here we have our fixed recurring rate type thing. This is just telling us how we physically sold the product. Now, all other piece of information that we see on here, right? We typically see feeding from a CRM. A lot of our customers use Salesforce and Salesforce CPQ. Our system is designed in a way that we can continuously update our contracts and make modifications. And these modifications can come from a third-party system, right? It can come from the CRM because most companies, still want to use Salesforce as their individual CRM. But additionally, like I said, we have those charges. So at the creation of the subscription item, we now create these charges. And this is a pretty simple example. We're charging $500 per month, but now we get a nice forecasted view of all of our billing activities. You can see it's $500 per month with our bill dates also coming in as well, right? So the system is determining when we're going to be billing this. But what's so great about this is we can get a forecasted view into when and how we're going to be billing this individual customer. Now, I did give you a scenario where maybe a customer is going to call and says, hey, I just want to terminate my contract a little bit early and have that information be updated. Now, Zone at any point can come in and say, hey, let's just fast forward a contract. Customer just needs to terminate early, right? By simply updating the end date and saving our subscription item, this is going to reforecast our charges. It gets rid of those 12 charges, but it's not going to be forecasted into just the remaining, right? So we're not going to have any of those additional charges. That's the key link and how we connect to Zone, how we connect to the revenue module. Our charges are really the basis of what ultimately ends up on the revenue arrangement. So modifying the charges. I fast forwarded the contract, but what if I just extended it by 3 months? A lot of times I've seen customers have scenarios where, hey, unfortunately, we couldn't reach a final agreement before end of contract expiring. Can we just extend for 2 more months just until we get everything up in a row and, keep paying the same rate? Yeah, absolutely. Just come in and update the end date. What's so great is the system can automatically update the end date, right? If it's coming in from a third party, CRM system, if it's a renewal rule, right? Hey, just continuously update the end date if it's an evergreen contract as well. So now that we've given kind of a firm grounding of what ZoneBilling is, how it ultimately functions, let's dig a lot deeper into the revenue recognition side. So with that, I just want to kind of lay out the scenario here. So now we have a fixed recurring license, and we're going to talk about this annual uplift in just a bit. And we're going to be billing on a monthly basis, right? 24 months, even periods. Now, how does that ultimately look, right? What we just saw is we have our subscription item and our charges. Remember, charges are the ones that become future line items on an invoice. But when zone revenue is in play, what we now use is our revenue configurator. Now, this is set up for you as part of the implementation. It's not something you need to do on a day-to-day basis. But what this does is tells the system, how do I look at charges? How do I understand charges, group charges, sort charges, for them to ultimately create native NetSuite revenue records? So that's going to be your arrangement and your element. Your arrangement, like I said, is typically on a one-to-one relationship with your subscription. Now, typically, your subscription items are on a one-to-one relationship with your element, but your element is ultimately your performance obligation. What are we delivering to our customers, right? And that's going to determine, with the item master, the revenue recognition rule. So visually, how does that look? Like I said, 24-month contract billing at $100 per month. What that's going to result in is a revenue element with a revenue plan underneath for $100 per month. So let's actually hop back into NetSuite and take a look at that. So again, pretty simple contract that we have in place, right? It's just a 1-year or a 2-year contract in place for $100. Now, when I drill into my charges here, you can see that I have my forecast view, just like I saw before. But again, we're keeping it simple just as we look at a single product here. But now, when I dive into my revenue recognition, right, I've now created a single revenue element. So I've taken those charges, I've looked at them, my revenue configuration ultimately determined how to create those charges and group them. And now we can dive into our revenue element and our revenue arrangement. So like I said, the revenue arrangement is really your contract for how to recognize revenue. The subscription dictates when and how to bill. The revenue arrangement is going to say when and how to recognize revenue. But it's all based on the item master, right? That's so important because we're leveraging that as part of the subscription item. So that's going to determine, is it recognized even periods? Is it, on creation? Zone has an events capability as well. So if you want to recognize it percent complete, if you want to recognize on, a quantity or an amount. What's great is we don't need to rely on leveraging, percent completes in the PSA side of the house, or the professional services automation, right? We can leverage our own events, and they can be updated, via CSV, or they can be updated manually as well. But now we have our item here, and the system is really, from revenue, is really kind of made up of 2 components. We have our revenue recognition rules, so in this case, even periods, which ultimately creates the plan. The plan is going to be your breakdown or your waterfall of how we're going to recognize revenue here. And as I dive into our plan, you can see we have that view, right? This would, completely give you that entire visibility into everything here. And just to kind of, to recap what we just saw here, we have our $100 per month from a billing perspective, and $100 per month from a revenue. Now let's talk about that upsell scenario or that scheduled uplift. What happens on an annual basis? I'm going to change that contract by 5%. I'm giving uplift. What we can do is start off with $300 per month, or sorry, $100 per month, $300 per quarter, which would equate to $315 the second year. This is a scheduled change. Now, from a revenue perspective, a lot of customers need to ultimately recognize revenue on a straight line basis. So Zone, giving you the ability to have your scheduled uplifts, is going to give you that capability here. Right? This is now where the Zone revenue configuration is so powerful, is because we give you that information and we give you that capabilities to recognize revenue. Now, how do we actually accommodate for this 300 and the 315, right? Let's go hop back into NetSuite and take a look at that. I was going to hop into a different contract here, right? So let's go into a separate contract. Again, very similar structure, just to your contract in place. But now, when I look at my SaaS license and I look at my charges here, right, you can see we have a $300 per quarter and $315. Let's now take a look a little bit deeper at our subscription item here. When I'm looking at the charges, you can see here my service period is defining extending a period of time. Right, in previous examples, it was just one month. But additionally, when I look at my adjustments, I want to do a 5% annual uplift. Now, from a rev rec perspective, right, this is so important. You can see when the uplift is happening, but you can also see, hey, I actually need to recognize this on a straight line basis. And that's really pivotal. And the way that we do that is we now take that information, we take those charges, we're passing over the entire value of the contract, but it's still just a single line item, right? This would have to be done manually and inside of native NetSuite's revenue, right? And not have that ability to schedule those uplifts. But again, taken to our revenue arrangement, we can go to our plan just like we've done before. Right? And you can see here, it's over a 1 year period or 2 year period of time, and that 102 going out into the future. Again, lots of flexibility here. The key thing is our subscription flexibility is what's driving so much additional automation that you're going to be getting with revenue recognition. But what happens, for example, if instead of having this separate year two be treated as part of the same, what happens if it's a little bit different of a scenario? In this case, I actually want year two to create a separate and standalone revenue arrangement or revenue element. Now, why would someone want to do that, right? So there's a couple of scenarios that customers want to do that. One that really comes to mind is instead of a 5% price increase, maybe it is a ramped quantity. Maybe the customer's starting off as a quantity of 10, and they know in years two, they're adding an additional 5 seats or 5 users or whatever the quantity unit of measure that you're ultimately having is. So this is giving you the flexibility to determine all with that revenue configuration. Again, nothing is structurally changing from a billing perspective. All of the revenue is happening automatically. So Zone's revenue configuration is determining how to look at these charges, like I said, group them, sort them, right? A lot of flexibility here. So again, let's go hop back into NetSuite here and we can see how this ultimately is working. All right. So again, back at our contract, let's quickly take a look at all of our billing charges, right? It's the same structure that we've had before, right? The $300 per quarter, then $315. But when I look at my revenue, you can see it's now 2 line items, and each one has an appropriate start and end date to be able to recognize only over its defined period of time. This is really, Zone's strength is the ability to continuously have that information funnel through, determine how many performance obligations are needed for the contract, and then ultimately pass that information over to the arm. At the same time, we're always going to be able to handle those upsell scenarios. So we continuously, make those modifications that we ultimately need. But I wanted to head back into the PowerPoint and walk through another scenario. Is we've had customers, and I'm going to go back for a second here. We've had customers that said, because of their way the contracts are quoted, year 2 is actually a separate subscription item. Now, how would you actually handle that? So, right, we would have our separate subscription item with all of its charges underneath here. But because of our groupings and our revenue configuration, it could still create a single revenue element. I've seen customers with 3-5-year contracts, all separate line items, because that's how the contracts are quoted and that's how the customer needed it. But that's now giving us the flexibility, because that's the single performance obligation that you need to deliver with your customers. We're going to be able to handle that with a single revenue element as it should be treated. All right. So just to quickly talk about, our last scenario that I wanted to kind of highlight today is, we're starting off again with a very basic contract here, a 12-month contract in place. But now we're going to be talking about some sort of upsell. So we're going to start off with a $2,400 per month contract, right? So we have starting off with a single subscription item, right? That's going to create a standalone revenue arrangement and a revenue element. But say after 2 months of the contract, you decided to add on a brand new subscription item, right? So different rates, different quantities, different items, doesn't matter. With the revenue configuration, we want to create a separate and standalone revenue arrangement, right? That's key, because you want to, be able to recognize these. Some customers don't want to actually bring them together, but some customers ultimately want to merge these together. So let's quickly take a look at how that ultimately looks inside the platform. So we're starting off with a basic contract, right? We have all of our charges and our revenue completely set up for us here, just like we've had before, right? But what I really want to kind of walk through is what's going to happen when you make those modifications, right? So kind of skipping back into that. We can now leverage something to automatically merge that information. So Zone has inside of its revenue capabilities a merge profile. And what this does is lets us use a safe search to determine when and how to retrospectively merge these revenue arrangements. Remember, these are separate and distinct revenue arrangements. But what's really key is the revenue merge profile. And for people who've been on the NetSuite platform, our merge profile is actually based upon a safe search. And that safe search is, we can set criteria. Now, my criteria that I had set up today was any contract that happened, any contract modification, an upsell or a downsell that happens within the first 90 days or the first 3 months of the original, subscription start date, merge those together. But if it's outside of that, I want to consider those distinct, and I don't want those to be part of the same revenue arrangement. So our merge profile is what's really driving the automation here. No longer are you going to have to go through and actually manually click which ones you want to create. We're going to be able to update that information for you. But here, one of the things that I did set up here in this example was what happens where there was a merge, but also reallocation as well. So as you can see, we had kind of a dip from recognizing $800 per month when the periods were closed, and then to recognize $744 per month. And then we then change revenue element 2, right, to be recognized on a straight line basis for 7-Eleven, right? Just assume a basic allocation. Again, all allocations and all fair value and SSPs all derive off native NetSuite's ARM. We're not changing any of that. Zone is really just changing the source of the revenue arrangement, as also well as some of those key dates, those dates fields, or so if you wanted to update those end dates. So as I quickly take a look at that, right, we have our revenue arrangement, right? And inside of our revenue arrangement, just there's 2 items here, right? And as you can see, we have our contract for 7-Eleven going down into the future, right? And if you look at our the original line item as well, you can see here we recognize the $800 per month, but the system needs to do that kind of retrospective look back and do a catch up in those 2 open periods as well. Right. So if it was a closed period, it recognized in the next open month, which could be February, it could be March. And that's so it's automatically going to be able to do that for you. Now, in this last example that I was talking about was really focusing on an upsell product. The Zone can also handle that the same way if it was a downsell or even a negative. I've seen customers say, hey, our CRM, our Salesforce in this case, is just going to tell us it's a negative $5,000 downsell, right? That information could be funneled that way as well. So our subscription and our subscription items are really going to be, driving us on how and where to recognize revenue recognition here. All right. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. Do want to open up for any questions, so please submit them over the chat. I'm happy to answer them. I hope you found today's sessions valuable on how ZoneBilling can really work in conjunction with NetSuite's advanced revenue management to be able to handle those additional contracts, modifications, adjustments that you're going to be coming across on a day-to-day basis without having to do the labor's task of canceling those sales orders or recognizing or billing outside of your system, right? That disparate system that we talked about early on. So with that, let's open up for questions.
All right, so we'll open up to any questions here. We do have a question about NetSuite's Suite Billing module. It looks very similar to NetSuite's Suite Billing module. How is Zone different? Really, we like to think of Zone as a more advanced version of Suite Billing. If you have one-time charges and standard fixed recurring, usually Suite Billing is going to be an okay fit. A lot of the revenue stuff, pretty much everything that Joe showed in the demo, though, that is an enhancement that we bring with Zone. We don't require the use of sales orders, for example. We've got that flexible subscription record that will automatically feed directly into NetSuite's ARM. When you get outside of just your standard fixed recurring and your one-time charges, you get into any variable billing. That's really where Zone was built to be more flexible and to be able to handle a lot of those use cases. So we do have comparisons between each. We could spend a ton of time going through that. So definitely, if you want to leave your info, we'd love to hop on a call and go through the differences and the benefits of Zone versus Suite Billing. So there's a second question around uplifts that may be unknown. And the example given is around a consumer price index or a CPI adjustment. We do have the ability to connect directly into the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the country. I'm assuming that this is for the US, but it could be for other governments' readings as well. And during renewal time, you would be able to set up, do you want to do the uplift based on the CPI? Do you want to do it based on the greater of the CPI, or the uplift that was like maybe the maximum uplift that was put in the contract? Either way, we will be able to do that uplift in year 2 and then change that in year 3 if needed. And because the subscription is the source for the revenue recognition, that would automatically be updated in NetSuite's revenue management, because that's the source transaction, rather than having to use a sales order, doing any debook, rebook, and any of that manual effort. It would work the same way that Joe just showed. The only difference, like you said, not knowing exactly what it's going to be until that reading occurs. All right, third question, how are variable monthly billings handled? I'm assuming that means usage-based billing. There's a lot of different ways that I can answer that question, but at as broad of a level as I can, we've built Zone to handle any type of variable or usage-based billing, whether that's standard variable billing that's changing month over month, whether those are things like user licenses that may be fluctuating month over month. We're able to connect with any proprietary system, or if they're originating these changes in maybe Salesforce CRM, any other CRM, any CPQ tool, but that will create charges for that variable amount, put them on the invoice, usually bill them in arrears. You also may have things like minimum commitments or prepayments. We can handle all of those as well. So really there's a ton of different ways that we handle variable billings for our customers. Yes, the next question, we absolutely handle fair value allocations. Joe kind of got to this towards the end. We're not necessarily changing that part within NetSuite's ARM. We are enhancing it, however, because again, the source transaction becomes the subscription. And if you need any reallocations, we're going to do that automatically if there's any amendments, upsells, downsells, date changes, and so on. The next question, this seems set for subscription billing. Our rev rec is more tied to milestone deliverables at different, milestone deliverables, PS, professional services at different intervals. We absolutely can handle your professional services milestone-based billing. We typically either are just bringing that information directly into the subscription item, which would be that professional services charge. We treat that similar to the usage type that I was just referring to, but we have the ability to bring in percentages and automate the billing and the revenue recognition from there. So absolutely, we focused on subscriptions today. We have plenty of services companies, and most of our customers that we work with have a mix of both subscription-based billing, but also milestone-based billing for professional services. So again, if that's something that if you're curious and seeing, we'd love to hop on a call and do a more tailored demo for you. All right, and then I think, Jennifer, you were responding to the usage-based specifically. That's another thing. We've really built our system to be very flexible when it comes to usage-based billing. So whether that's your standard look at the date range and do a quantity times price, or if it's something much more complex like that, we can easily handle it within ZoneBilling, and we'd love to give you a tailored demo. And I guess, David, to further answer your question, we would just use either a milestone or a percent complete revenue recognition type rule, and that's how we would handle a professional services scenario, different than what we went through today. And then again, those can be on the same revenue arrangement that any subscriptions or usage-based billing as well. Yeah, so David, on your question on royalties, yes, that's exactly right. We would just treat that as usage-based. That would just be a default one-time posting in the period that the royalty occurred. But again, we would be able to handle that as long as it's being fed into the contract that it's associated with it, which means that then it would be tied to that revenue arrangement. Yeah, it would just be set up as a standard usage, like you said. Yeah, absolutely. So if you scan the QR code on there, that'll send you to a link that can reach you out to a sales team member. Otherwise, I'll make a note here and make sure that someone reaches out to you. And that's for anyone else that's on the call. Again, we'd love to give you a more tailored demo to your use cases. Try to make these webinars as broad as possible, but especially with billing, everybody has their own specific use cases, and we see a little bit of everything. So we'd love to show you more.